This is the GARIS Masculist MGTOW flyers, that is 2 3-page essays on the themes of Masculism and MGTOW, written by and read aloud by Prof. Dr. Hugo de GARIS. This is flyer number 207, entitled, "If the gender politicians don't give the Masculists what they want, the Masculists will wipe out whole populations by crashing the birth rate." The flyer itself. If the gender politicians don't give the Masculists what they want, the Masculists will wipe out whole populations by crashing the birth rate. Prof. Dr. Hugo de GARIS. Prof. Hugo de GARIS at yahoo.com. And website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. Let me make it a little bigger. A quiet revolution has been taking place over the past decade or so. In Japan today, a third of young men under 30 refuse to have relationships with women, causing a catastrophic decline in the Japanese birth rate, which is now at 1.3 children per woman. The replacement birth rate is 2.1, which means that if this 1.3 rate continues for a century, Japan's population will fall to about a sixth of what it currently is. That is a decline from roughly 120 plus million to about 20 million. That's 1.3 over 2.1 equals 0.62. That is, each generation is only reproducing about 60% of itself. So after 4 generations, the population will be about 0.62 to the 4th power equals 0.15. That is 15%. After 8 generations, the Japanese population would be 2% of its current figure. That is effectively wiped out, so that the Chinese could colonize Japan easily. A similar story is also happening in the US, where 70% of young men under 35 are refusing to marry and have kids. A similar calculation would show that, except for US immigration, the US white population would also be wiped out in a shorter period than in Japan. What is causing this calamity? In a phrase, the fluffy, feminist-dominated divorce courts. I need to explain a bit. A fluffy is a masculist term for a traditional woman who expects to be able to parasite off a man's money. Most feminists are in fact fluffy feminists, who've had their feminist consciousness raised, but not their masculist consciousness raised, for the simple reason that they know nothing about what the masculists want. Feminism, in its modern form, has been around for nearly half a century, so has expanded into the general population, which means that the gender politicians and divorce court judges and lawyers are mostly fluffy feminists, who thus have traditional non-masculist attitudes towards men, treating men as exploitable checkbooks to be abused. The injustices committed against men over the past few decades in the divorce courts have been so horrific and extensive, namely against tens of millions of US men, that the idea has grown up with the younger generation of US men that traditional marriage is toxic. These young men have seen with their own eyes what the divorce courts have done to their older male friends, and especially to their fathers. Typically, a divorcing man will lose his house, his kids, who with 90% probability will be given to his ex-wife as sole custodian. He will have to pay child support for up to 2 decades, and if his ex-wife is a career incompetent fluffy, he may also have to pay her alimony, perhaps for the rest of her parasitic life, with no legal or moral obligation on the fluffy ex-wife to get off her bum and become a FIP by getting an education and having a career. Half of today's women on campus are studying economically useless, career incompetent topics that will then cause them to look for robot male husbands to parasite upon when they're in their 30s, with their biological clock ticking hard, who will give them a middle-class house and lifestyle that they, with their career incompetence, are incapable of providing for themselves. The emotional trauma felt by these divorcing men is so great that their suicide rate screams up to about 100 times the usual rate. These men have lost their wives. Women initiate 70% of no-fault divorces, their kids, their homes, and are made paupers by the fluffy feminist attitudes of the divorce courts. So it's not surprising that men in their millions are voting with their feet and refusing to marry. The attitudes of these young US males is, why play Russian divorce roulette when there are only two chambers in the barrel? That is, why enter into an institution, that is marriage, when the odds are nearly 50-50 that the man will be financially massacred? Men are not fools, so during the coming years necessary for the fluffy feminist-dominated divorce courts to be purged, they refuse to marry. The Masculists are men's livers, who do for men what feminists do for women. That is, they aim to liberate men from those institutions and attitudes that oppress men. The divorce court system is one obvious example of something that is screaming out to be reformed, but nothing happens because the gender politicians who make the laws are afraid of the power of the women's lobby. For example, there have been states in the US which started to implement automatic, default, joint custody of children after a divorce. The fluffy feminists, with emphasis on the word fluffy, then went on the warpath against the politicians who made the proposal of joint custody, to the point that they lost the next election and were eliminated from power. Since then, nearly all gender politicians have not dared to counter the wishes of the feminist lobby, even though the legislation desired by the feminists has such catastrophic effects on men. The gender politicians simply haven't cared about the interest of men up to now. But that is all about to change. Feminism has changed over the past half century. It used to be about equal rights for women, that is, second wave feminism. The first wave being the push for votes for women early in the 20th century. For example, this is second wave feminism. For example, equal pay for equal work, the right to an abortion, equal rights to employment, etc. Most liberal males agreed with this and did not oppose it. However, feminism has spread from the sages, that is the intellectuals, to the peakers, that is the masses. Why peaker? Peakers are people whose intelligences place them in the peak of the IQ bell curve. In other words, they're average. They're average Joes. To the peakers, the masses. So that most feminists today are non-sages. A sage is an intellectual. And hence a lot less intelligent than the sages and a lot more irrational and uncaring about the well-being of males. These average women who are feminists are quite happy to see their ex-husbands be forced by law to hand over his house to them, have him pay her alimony and child support so that she can remain being a career incompetent fluffy. She is very happy with this. But the men are not, and they are not remaining passive, or at least not entirely so. They are angry and recently have formed a variant of the Masculist movement called MGTOW, men going their own way, which consists of millions of men who refuse to marry and certainly refuse to have kids, spending their money on themselves and avoiding fluffy feminists like the plague. The essential difference between the Masculists and the MGTOWs is that the latter are apolitical. They do not organise political events nor apply political pressure on gender politicians to get the laws changed that are so egregiously unfair to men. MGTOWs simply drop out of the marriage market. They quietly refuse to marry and have kids. They often decide to work less, since they need to earn less money to cover their own modest lifestyles, and hence have a lot more free time to pursue their own dreams and interests. Many MGTOWs are so disgusted by the entitlement mentality of young women. That is, they feel they are entitled simply because they are young women at the peak of their sexual attractiveness. That these young MGTOWs refuse even to have sex with such women. They totally ignore them, as do the herbivore men in Japan. Many MGTOWs feel much freer than the average robot male, a masculist term for a traditional male who expects to be parasited upon by a fluffy wife, who gets trapped into paying for a fluffy wife who will live off his money both before and after the divorce. To the Masculist, a fluffy enslaves a robot male, so it's not surprising that Masculists advise men strongly to prefer having relationships with FIPs, a Masculist term for the type of woman that Masculists want all women to be, that is, financially independent person, FIP, FIP, rather than fluffies. To force fluffies to become FIPs, Masculists refuse to have relationships with them, so that if a fluffy wants to eat, she will have to become a FIP. A fluffy can only become a fluffy by getting her financial claws into a robot male. But the supply of robot males, or good men, as the fluffy feminists label them, that is, passive, exploitable, gullible men, is drying up. So together with the MGTOWs, millions of young women now are going manless, childless, and hence are becoming utterly miserable, since the number one biological imperative of women is to raise the next generation. In Japan, the third of young women who are manless are referred to as dry fish ladies, an allusion to the dryness of their vaginas. There is some heated discussion between the Masculists and the MGTOWs over the most desirable strategy the men's movement should take to alleviate men's suffering. The MGTOWs are politically passive, political pygmies, yet indirectly they will have a major political impact on society if there are many more millions of them. The Masculists, on the other hand, need to become a lot more politically aggressive, learning a lesson from what the feminists have done. The Masculists need a manifesto to help guide them in their implementation of the following political/social agenda. Masculist Manifesto 1. Masculist ideology. Masculists need to spread their ideology, especially using the internet, YouTube, and the conventional mass media, so that Masculist ideas are widely spread throughout society. 2. Enormous moral pressure against fluffies. Masculists need to put enormous moral pressure on women to be FIPs, otherwise they will not get a man. This message needs to be taught in the media and in schools, so that girls grow up with the expectation that they are to be as career conscious as boys. Women are to pull their weight financially, or they'll be punished by being left manless and hence childless. Masculists need to label fluffies in the media as parasites, immoral, slavers of men, vermin, and to be wiped out by men refusing to have relationships with them. 3. Menfair divorce court reform. The Masculists need to reform the anti-male gender laws, of which there are many. For example, the divorce courts need to be made men-fair. For example, custody of children needs to be given by default to both parents, joint custody, with the ownership of the house remaining with the original owner or owners. The two parents can live in a big city and both have jobs locally, so that for a week or a month, one parent could have the kids while the other lives in a small nearby apartment or rented room. With both parents being FIPs, this is doable, and the man gets to keep his house. He pays no alimony and gets half the custody of the kids. 4. Para. Another major discrimination against men is the lack of a para, that's paternity rejection right. Women have had a MARA, that's maternity rejection right, since the 70s, thanks to feminist political pressure. The MARA is usually called the abortion right, but men have no such right and are routinely forced to pay paternity money to kids they never wanted in the first place, thus having their lives ruined. The Masculists want a man to be given the right to say that he doesn't want the kid in the case of a pregnancy that he doesn't agree with. If the woman goes ahead and has the child, it's her sole financial responsibility. 5. Lobbying of gender politicians. Masculists need to lobby the gender politicians far more aggressively than they have done so far. For example, if the male governor of a US state refuses to pass menfair legislation due to his fear of the feminist reaction, then the Masculists could use French direct action techniques, which the French farmers have developed to a fine art, which are extremely effective. For example, the Masculists could dump a truckload of cow shit at the entrance of the governor's office, then call the national media to explain why, using the event to abuse the governor on the national media as a male feminist, a traitor to his own sex, since he refuses to listen to what the Masculists want. The publicity would be so effective that the governor is then tainted as man unfriendly in his state and loses the next election. This would send a message to other state governors that they need to listen to the Masculists equally with the feminists and try to diffuse the sex war. 6. Other legal discriminations against men. There are many other legal discriminations against men that need to go. For example, differences in retirement ages, conscription for men but not for women, only men involved in military combat but not for women, giving men the message that men are disposable and women are precious. Penalties and conviction rates for identical crimes for men and women should be made the same. Levels of research funding into men's diseases, for example prostate cancer, should be made much the same as for breast cancer. Parliaments should have both men's and women's gender issues committees. Universities should have government-supported men's studies programs, etc. There are many such legal discriminations against men. 7. Birth rate crash, ace card. The Masculists and the MGTOWs combined can play their ace card in giving a dire warning to the gender politicians and to the media that unless the grievances of the Masculists and the MGTOWs are met, then the following slogan becomes true. That is the title of this essay. If the gender politicians don't give the Masculists what they want, that is the above list, then the Masculists and the MGTOWs will wipe out whole populations by causing a crash in the birth rate. This reality that is already causing Japanese politicians to tear their hair out will only become more apparent as time passes. Gender politicians in Japan are totally missing the point when in their traditional, conservative, unimaginative culture are telling young men to man up, become carnivores, that is traditional male, robot males, rather than herbivores, grass eaters, as they're known in Japan. Japanese young men look at their fathers, who work 11-hour days, 3-hour commute times, who get home so late they orphan their kids, who hand over their paychecks to their fluffy wives, who play cards and tennis with their fluffy friends. These young men are so appalled at the lifestyles of their fathers that they want nothing to do with them. They also want nothing to do with parasitic traditional fluffy females, whom they let rot on the shelf, the dry fish ladies. Masculists recognise that even if they do nothing and simply react as MGTOWs themselves, then eventually they will force the hand of the gender politicians and society in general to give the Masculists what they want. Either that or the whole population dies out. So sooner or later the Masculists/MGTOWs will win. Fluffies have no power if men refuse to pay for them. Men have the power to wipe out fluffies by refusing to have relationships with them and by applying enormous moral pressure against them. Any young woman who gets the label fluffy in her social circle will be given the kiss of death in terms of getting a man. She will be severely punished because she'll be manless, loveless, sexless, and especially childless and shunned from society. Oh, that woman deserves to keep rotting on the shelf. She's a fluffy. Young women in the West are really starting to take an interest in the MGTOW movement because there are so many MGTOWs, millions of them, across North America. There are more MGTOWs than Masculists, since it's much easier to be a MGTOW than a Masculist. It takes a Masculist more energy to organise political actions and create social pressure on fluffies than it takes to simply walk out passively on marriage, MGTOW style. So many men now are going MGTOW that women will soon be turning their attention towards the main source of the MGTOW problem, namely the fluffy feminist divorce courts. I wouldn't be at all surprised if radical fluffy feminists start assassinating divorce court judges and lawyers, reasoning that it is these judges and lawyers who are the ultimate cause of their manlessness and their childless misery. Feminism itself will become increasingly unpopular with women as they see that the fluffy feminists are the first category of women to be rejected by the Masculists and the MGTOWs. The current third wave feminism is more about creating a genocracy than about equal rights, which was the focus of the second wave. Third wave, that is genocratic feminism, will have a short life since it has been very short-sighted regarding men's interests. Fluffy feminists are very unwise to think that men will not react against their genocratic attitudes. Men are voting with their feet in refusing to have relationships with fluffy feminists, and especially fluffies. Given the growing war between the sexes, with tens of millions of men in the US being financially slaughtered in the fluffy feminist-dominated divorce courts and the rejection of fluffies by millions of MGTOWs, it's likely only a question of a few years before gender politicians start being assassinated by the sex war warriors of both sexes, and the public tide against fluffy feminism turns as society wakes up that the birth rate is plummeting. Soon the alarm bells will start ringing in parliaments around the world, and men's issues will finally start being seriously addressed, and about time. That's it. Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. YouTube channel name, De Garis, Masculist, MGTOW, Flyers.